Welcome to Magnificat News Program, dedicated to news from the Church. It is Wednesday, January 18, 2023, and these are our news. Cardinal Pell, the former Vatican Secretary for the Economy, has died. His heart fell after surgery for a hip replacement. In his last article, written shortly before his death and published afterwards, Cardinal Pell harshly criticizes the Synod on synodality. Pope Benedict's secretary has published a book containing, among other things, the deceased's views on what happened in the Church after his resignation. The Sandinista dictatorship in Nicaragua is conducting an absurd trial against a bishop who he accuses of having been involved in political activities against the regime. Peru's bishops have repeatedly called for a dialogue and an end to violence following serious clashes between police and protesters. Cardinal George Pell has died in Rome at the age of 81. The Cardinal had undergone a hip replacement operation, after which he suffered heart failure.
Cardinal George Pell was born in Australia in 1941. He was ordained a priest in 1966 and in 1987 was appointed titular bishop of Scala and auxiliary bishop in Melbourne, the diocese of which he became archbishop in 1996. In 2001, he was appointed Archbishop of Sydney. In 2003, he was created a cardinal by John Paul II. He participated in the 2005 conclave that elected Benedict XVI. He also participated in the conclave of 2013, in which Francis was elected. He was a member of the Congregation for Bishops and the Congregation for Divine Worship, among others. He was one of the 8 cardinals elected to the Council of Cardinals that was created by Pope Francis to assist him in governing the Church and reforming the Roman Curia. On 24 February 2014, he was appointed first prefect of the Holy See Secretariat for the Economy, a position he was forced to relinquish after being falsely accused of having abused 2 minors while Archbishop of Sydney. He was eventually sentenced and jailed for 13 months, but was eventually acquitted for the High Court of Australia.
Before his death, Cardinal Pell left an article to be published in a British newspaper, which became public after his death.
This article begins with a strong disqualification. The Synod is intent on building what they consider to be God's dream of synodality. Unfortunately, this divine dream has turned into a toxic nightmare despite the apparent good intentions of the bishops. As proof of this, the Cardinal presents a 45-page booklet summarizing the discussions of the first synodal stage, which, in the Cardinal's opinion, is one of the most incoherent documents Rome has ever issued. The document, entitled "Enlarge the Space of Your Tent," comprises the Church to a tent and seeks to accommodate not only the baptized who have faith, but anyone who is interested enough to listen. It is urged to be radically inclusive, in line with the motto, "No one is excluded." As a consequence, Pell adds, we must move away from disputes to dialogue, rejecting the distinction between believers and unbelievers. This means that because of differences of opinion on abortion, women's ordination, homosexual acts, polygamy, divorce, and remarriage, no definitive position on these issues can be established. What are we to make of this porridge, this overabundance of New Age goodwill? Asks Pell. It is not a summary of Catholic faith or New Testament teaching. It is incomplete, significantly hostile to apostolic tradition, and nowhere recognizes the New Testament as normative for any teaching on faith and morals. In addition, the synodal procedure tends to set aside the authority of bishops and ordained ministers, emphasizing a less hierarchical and more participatory governance of the Church. It does not allow bishops to vote or submit proposals, but can only transmit the views of the organizing committee to the Holy Father. The Synod's conclusions lead to increased confusion, an attack on traditional morality, the insertion into the dialogue of new Marxist jargon about exclusion, identity, marginalization, the voiceless, LGBTQ issues, and the postponement of Christian notions of forgiveness, sin, sacrifice, healing, and redemption.
Monsignor Gainswain, Pope Benedict's secretary, has published a book in which the pontific views on what happened after his resignation are recorded.
The late Benedict XVI personal secretary, Monsignor George Gainswain, has written a book which, in the words of its publisher, uncovers the blatant slander, dark maneuvers, mysteries, and scandals that tarnish Benedict XVI's reputation. Nothing but the truth. My Life at the Side of Pope Benedict XVI is the title of the book. Among other things, in it Monsignor Gainswain reveals the shock he suffered after being relieved of his duties as prefect of the papal household by Pope Francis. Back in the monastery where Benedict XVI was staying, he recalls that when he told Ratzinger about it, Ratzinger said to him in an ironic tone, "It seems that Pope Francis no longer trusts me and wants you to be my guardian." He also tells of the pain in the heart that Pope Francis, motu proprio, Traditionis Custodes, which considerably curtailed the possibility of priests celebrating Mass in the ancient rite called Benedict XVI. He also explains that in the constant comparison between Pope Francis and Benedict XVI have always saddened Ratzinger, especially when the commentary came from within the Vatican. He gives the example of the Argentinian Pope's decision not to live in the flats of the Apostolic Palace and to move to a smaller room in Casa Santa Marta. Gainswain stresses that Francis' decision cannot be attributed to a question of saving money, since even if no pontiff lives there, he still looks after in terms of cleaning and maintenance, but to the personal psychology of Pope Francis himself.
Monsignor Alvarez, Bishop of Matagalpa in Nicaragua, is on trial by a communist regime on charge of treason against the state.
Monsignor Alvarez, Bishop of the Diocese of Matagalpa, has been brought to trial on charges of conspiracy to attack national integrity and propagation of false news through information and communication technologies to the detriment of the state and Nicaraguan society. The judges ordered the bishop to be remanded in custody and confirmed his house arrest. An arrest warrant also remains in place for the priest Oriel Antonio Vallejos, who faces the same charges as the bishop and who remains in exile. On December 13, the court had admitted the charges against Monsignor Alvarez and confirmed the bishop's house arrest. Alvarez had been taken from the bishop's palace on August 19 by police officers, along with priests, seminarians, and lay people, after being forcibly locked up in his residence for 15 days on charges of attempting to organize violent groups. For more than a year, the Catholic Church has been persecuted in Nicaragua for allegedly supporting opponents of the Ortega government. In 2022, the Sandinista government expelled the Apostolic Nuncio, Monsignor Somertag, and 18 nuns of Mother Teresa of Calcutta from the country. It also imprisoned 7 priests and 2 collaborators from the Diocese of Matagalpa. closed 9 Catholic radio stations and removed 3 Catholic channels from television programming and prevented processions.
In the face of the grave situation in Peru, the bishops have called for an end to the violence, unlashed after the exiling of President Castillo.
The Peruvian bishops have issued 2 communiques within 24 hours of each other to call for an end to the violence that is ravaging the country with dozens of deaths. We cannot return to the dark area of terror that kept the country in mourning for 20 years. This situation deserves the strong condemnation of all, to reaffirm with absolute urgency the imperative, not to violence, wherever it comes from, said the Permanent Council of the Episcopal Conference of Peru, CEP. In the last 48 hours, the epicenter of the protest was the southeastern region of Puno, where Castillo had won nearly 90% of the votes in 2021. In addition to the 17 deaths on Monday in Juliaca, clashes between police and demonstrators, there was a brutal murder of a police officer burned alive in his car. The bishop's appeal is based precisely on this fact. The Permanent Council of the Episcopate condemns the attack against a police patrol in Puno, which ended with the death of a sub-officer José Luis Sonco Quispe, 29 years old, burned alive inside a police vehicle. Meanwhile, President Dina Boluarte decreed a state of emergency and a 3-day curfew in the Puno region, while the Attorney General's office opened an investigation against her, Prime Minister Alberto Otarola, and other members of her cabinet for genocide and homicide, in reference to the repression by the police who, according to some witnesses, fired on the demonstrators.
Our editorial this week is dedicated to the death of Cardinal Pell and rumors about the health and resignation of Pope Francis.
Last week's commentary was dedicated to a will. 2 wills actually. The will of Pope Benedict and the last words he said before he died. This week, I want to talk about another will, although perhaps that is not the right word. I am talking about Cardinal Pell, who has just died. And he has left a written article, a posthumous article, because it had not yet been published at the time of his death. But before Cardinal Pell's death, many things have happened this week. As soon as Pope Benedict XVI died, a rumor began to circulate insistently that Pope Francis was about to resign, and that if he had not done so, it was because he did not want there to exist 2 emeritus popes. This rumor that Pope Francis is going to resign has been with him since almost the beginning of his pontificate. I have already said before that the Pope is not a person, at least I think, that he is not the kind of person who quits. It is true that his health is not perfect. He is 86 years old. It is true that his knee problem has not been solved, and that undoubtedly it must be causing him severe pain in spite of the painkillers. But it seems to me that if he had something more serious, the doctors would not allow him to go on this trip to the Congo and South Sudan in a few days. Of course, at 86 years of age, anything can happen, a serious deterioration of his health. But if this does not happen, my opinion is that Pope Francis will not resign, contrary to what some people say or wish. The second thing that has been raised this week is that now Pope Francis is going to be able to govern as he wants to govern, because up to now, supposedly, if he has not done so, it has been because the existence of Pope Benedict was holding him back. According to them, Pope Benedict was a kind of catalyst of discontent, and if he had not been there, Francis would have done other things. I repeat, the same as with the resignation, it does not seem to me that Pope Francis is a type of person who limits himself, especially when he was aware, when he knew that Benedict was going to remain silent no matter what happened. There is the proof: silence before the publication of Amoris Laetitia, silence before the publication of Traditionis Custodis, and silence before certain very important appointments, which, of course, did not please Benedict at all, because they went against what he had done and how he had governed the church. Pope Benedict kept silent, and Pope Francis knew that and was continuing on it. That is why I do not believe that the absence of Pope Benedict will free Pope Francis, as some say, and he will be able to be himself from now on. It seems to me, and of course I could be wrong, that these things are going to continue in the same way as they had been up to now, unless there are surprises, because life certainly always has surprises. The third event of this week has been the publication of the book of the personal secretary of Pope Benedict, Monsignor Gaswin. The book is entitled Nothing But the Truth, and has been welcomed almost universally as a revenge of Gaswin against Francis for having removed him as prefect of the pontifical household, as a harsh attack against Francis. It seems to me that those who think this, I do not know if they know Gaswin or not. I personally do not know him. I believe that those who think this have forgotten that there are people who know how to be faithful to their friends. Simply like that. There are people who know how to be faithful to their friends in the middle of a crowd. That changes from one moment to another. The unbreakable fidelities, who change them from one to another and from one moment to another. And that the same was very faithful to one is very faithful to the next, even if they do not have much to do. Or just as there are many who have made silence their way of survival, there are some, even if there are few, who know how to be faithful to their friends. It seems to me that what Gaswin has done is an act of love and fidelity to someone he appreciated very much and considered his teacher, someone he took care of his body and soul, the Pope Emeritus, Pope Benedict XVI. It does not seem to me that it is an attack against, but a plea in favor of. And it has allowed us to know in reality how an emeritus pope should act. Because if we have seen that in front of things that he did not like, Benedict was silent. Benedict stayed quiet. In the same way, an emeritus pope will have to behave in the future if emeritus popes will exist again. Then came the death of Cardinal Pell, a truly unforeseen event, a seemingly simple operation in which his heart failed him. The first thing to do, is to pray for his soul, so that God may give him the peace that his enemies try to take away from him without success. His enemies from outside and his enemies from within the church. Pell is a confessor. Pell is a martyr without bloodshed. His defense of the church, his desire to collaborate with Francis, who had put him at the head of the finances of the church for that purpose, earned him so many enemies who accused him of something absurd, which did not have the slightest hint of plausibility, and yet, with judges suspiciously in favor of the ridiculous, he was sent to prison, where he was for more than a year in solitary confinement, where he could have stayed for the rest of his life. Fortunately, the High Court of Australia decided that the conviction was absurd and had no legal basis, acquitted him and released him. But Pell, who was never one to keep quiet, Pell had written an article that had not been published when his death came surprisingly, unexpectedly. That article, known later, could be said to be a testament. It is a very hard allegation against the Synod of Synodality, not against the Synod of Germany, but against the Synod of Synodality. It is a very hard allegation. He says it is. He qualifies it as follows: a nightmare from which we must get rid of as soon as possible, which is something, his words, the draft that has already been published, which is an incoherent document, the most incoherent document ever published in Rome, he says. Well, this is a plea signed by someone who has authority, had moral authority in the church. However, it does not seem to me that this harsh criticism from the late Cardinal Pell on the Synod of Synodality will have much effect. And it does not seem to me that it will have much effect because his was already a voice crying in the wilderness. It has also been said these days that he is the author of a document that circulated among the cardinals last year and which is a fierce criticism of the pontificate of Francis. The document is authored under a pseudonym, Demos People, and criticizes all the points that seem to the author to be contrary to the doctrine, teaching, and tradition of the Church in this pontificate. However, it is a document written with a pseudonym, that is to say, an anonymous one. To attribute this document to Cardinal Pell seems to me to be risky if one is not certain, that is to say so. I think that what Pell has actually said, not only with that article where he describes the Synod of Synodality as a toxic nightmare, but attributing Demos to Cardinal Pell is not necessary and seems to me really risky. It is much better to see what Pell has said with all certainty in order to meditate on it and draw conclusions. One of the conclusions to be drawn is that the Church is subject to very strong internal tensions. I think this is evident. It is unquestionable. Apart from being informed, which we must be, the most important thing in this complicated moment is to pray. To pray. To ask God, our Lord, who does exist, although some seem to have forgotten him. To ask God, our Lord, to hear the cry of his people, as the book of Genesis tells us that he did with the Israelite slaves in Egypt. To hear the cry of his suffering people and to come soon to liberate them. See you next week, God willing.
We will continue to keep you informed about what is happening in the Church. You can visit our website, www.magnificat.tv. See you in 2 weeks, God willing.